I'm a dumb engineer who doesn't understand Peter Attia and Dave Feldman's detail and all the, which LDL particle is bad this week. But what I understand is that, in the food system, if you're eating fat and carbs together, you'll eat more and get fat. And similarly, if you're fueling on glucose and have low fat in your blood, then that's sort of okay. And the other extreme, if you've got, higher fat and lower glucose in your blood, is sort of okay. But where you get into trouble is where you've got high LDL and lots of fat in your blood and high glucose. The LDL becomes oxidized because it's hanging around with the glucose, and that's when you get into trouble. So it's just the same theme again and again through all my work is, fat plus carbs together leads to overeating, obesity, and poor metabolic health. So it's the same thing.
Hey, Marty, how are you? Good to see you. Hey,
well, chat, man.
Thank you. Welcome. Finally getting to chat with you. I've been following your work for a number of years now, and I appreciate all you're doing. I know you're down under in Australia. So where are you, like Sydney, or where are you
located? Brisbane.
Brisbane. Okay. So you are 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that?
7
a.m.
Thanks for shifting the call. Sorry. It was 2 a.m.
No. Yeah. I was surprised when you agreed to that. I said, I talked to Felicia. I said, I think it's like 2 a.m. where he is. So yeah, I do a lot of these 2, 3 p.m. things for the folks in Australia. So anyway, welcome. You have been interested in nutrition for a number of years, and you've been, writing extensively about it and have put some really neat material together. I guess, what did your interest start with your wife being a type 1 diabetic? Is that kind of the story I heard?
Yeah, basically stumbled into it with wife type 1 diabetic, and the son unfortunately became type 1 in December. So got a, very vested interest in understanding nutrition and what actually works in the family.
Yeah. And there's nothing, you either, if you have type 1 diabetes, you learn a heck of a lot about nutrition, or you suffer very quickly and very gravely, unfortunately. So, do you know, your wife, was she a lifelong diabetic? It was something that she developed later in life, or how did that happen?
Yeah, since she was 10.
So okay, as a kid, yeah. It's classically has been described as juvenile onset or type. It used to be, now it's kind of becoming more common in adults getting it.
Yeah.
As well as, unfortunately the type 2 the kids are getting now. So it's all kind of mishmashed together. I guess, this is it's a fascinating topic to me, because I think I just literally posted on Twitter, there was a diabetic nurse educator talking about, carbs are brain food, and you have to have carbohydrates in your diet or your body will just shut down. And I'm looking at her going, man, I haven't really eaten any in about 6 years. And arguably, and it's questionable, but arguably my brain still works. But some people would question that. But, some
people debate that online.
Some people would say that.
I think you're doing pretty well, buddy.
But let me ask you, it's interesting, because I like I said, I just see a lot of folks with type 1 that are doing well with low carbs and carnivore diets, extremely well in many cases. And we've had a few of them that have, and the diagnosis is unclear. Maybe they didn't really have type 1, or it was some version. They've been able to kind of come off insulin for a period of time. And, it's really controversial. But I'm just like, hey man, they're doing it. And maybe they were misdiagnosed, or maybe it's, it's something that's going on. But what do you find? As far as, type 1, type 2 diabetes, obviously there's some differences there, but do you find that the standard of care, control carbohydrates, 60 grams at every meal, whatever it is that's being talked about, do you find that to be particularly helpful advice?
Yeah, I suppose I was shocked when I went to the hospital. I got another hospital appointment today with the son, and the nutrition advice hasn't changed in 30 years since my wife got diagnosed. It's the same crap advice, basically. So yeah, it's prioritize carbohydrates, and here's how you dose for your carbohydrates, and that just leaves you on this massive insulin glucose roller coaster that leaves you feeling crap. And when your blood sugar crashes, when you take too much insulin, you make really poor food choices at that point. If my wife injects too much insulin, it's just, hoover through the cupboard and the fridge, and there's no stopping you once your blood sugars are that low because you've overdosed with insulin. So getting off that roller coaster, Bernstein talks about the law of small numbers, where small inputs of carbohydrate and insulin lead to small errors, and you can control that really well. So definitely a protein-focused diet with lower carbohydrate works wonders for people with any type of diabetes, really.
Yeah, I don't think, people appreciate, when someone is truly hypoglycemic and they're sweating and, they're really hungry and they're in a panic mode. They're just trying to get that blood sugar up as fast as possible. So they're shoving candies and chocolates and whatever else they can get it, just so they don't feel so awful. And then they turn around and now their blood sugar is shot super high again, and they're correcting again. It's just
it's an awful life, and the energy levels and depression and hunger generated by that mismatch of glucose and insulin.
Then when the glucose is shooting up, then they start getting real fatigued and they can't stay awake, and it's just really it really is challenging. It makes you appreciate what your pancreas does for you, when you have to manage it yourself.
So lucky to be. Yeah.
Exactly. Do you find, let's talk about, because protein, it's something that protein doesn't get necessarily a free pass, and you still have to account for that. And there's, you're probably familiar with like the Warsaw formula, where they talk about even fat has an insulin requirement. So can you expound upon that a little bit? I'm sure you've looked into it.
Yeah. That's sort of where I started diving into this whole thing with the food insulin index, when I discovered some data from University of Sydney. I downloaded it and did a bit of back analysis and found that basically protein requires about half as much insulin as carbohydrate over the first 2 hours. But the thing to keep in mind with that data is it's only over the first 2 hours. So over the longer term, fat still requires some insulin. But I suppose what I've learned with playing with type 1 diabetes is, for people on a low carb diet, like my wife and my son, like 70-80% of their insulin requirements is just to hold their stored energy in storage. Like whether they eat or not, they still need like 80% of their insulin dosing per day. So that everybody talks about insulin toxicity and insulin bad, and we need to avoid insulin, and anything that provokes an insulin response like protein is to be avoided. But really, what you need to do to improve your metabolic health and insulin sensitivity and reverse all the disease related to energy toxicity is be less fat. So it's all about body composition, like you and Ted Naiman and everybody else talk about. You need to manage your body composition as the primary priority. Yeah,
it's interesting because I did an interview with a gal who's type 1 diabetic, and she was saying, I've gone on a carnivore diet. I love it. I feel better. I'm getting stronger. I'm putting on muscle, but my insulin requirement has gone up. And I'm like, well, that's okay, because you're using it. And this is an interesting thing. And I just read recently that, when you become insulin resistant, you are resistant to the effects of insulin lowering your blood glucose, but some of those other effects of insulin are still in play. And I don't know that you are insulin resistant towards everything. Like everything insulin does, it's an anabolic hormone, it's a storage hormone. So you're insulin resistant to the glucose lowering effect of insulin, but you're not insulin resistant to some of the other things. So I think that the point you make about, I can keep my blood glucose low by giving myself massive amounts of insulin, but I may be still storing fat. Insulin's effect is still in play. And so therefore we still have to manage our body composition through strength training, eating the appropriate amount of nutrients that we need. Now there's satiety that plays a role in here. And this is where I think low carb diets, carnivore diets seem to have a big benefit in many cases.
Protein focused diets, I think, is the key. Yeah. Getting enough protein. And you can overdo the fat and become insulin resistant. People don't understand that. I think that's a big failing of the keto movement over the last 5 years, is that people have believed, I can eat unlimited fat because it doesn't create an insulin response. But over the longer term, you'll end up storing more energy and needing more basal insulin to keep your fat in storage. So at that point, you become insulin resistant to all your insulin. But insulin's a magic hormone, and like my son has gone from 77 kilos to 90 kilos since December, and become a super power lifter, like putting back on the muscle and weight that he lost.
Yeah, well, like you said, he probably had declining insulin activity for a number of years before he got the diagnosis, and then you just can't keep weight on. As you know, the early diabetics
can't keep the muscle on.
Can't keep anything on. Right?
So once he started taking enough insulin and eating plenty of protein and training, he just ballooned up into this, power lifter and did his first powerlifting competition and did really well.
Yeah, so that's good. And that's awesome. It's good to start that. I think that, like I said, you take advantage of your youth, you maximize how much muscle you can lay down. And it's not that you can't continue to put it on a later life, but you really are in a nice place those first three decades or so where you can really just pack on the muscle. And I would advise any young person that might be listening, now's the time to do it. Well, let's talk about nutrient optimization, because I know I can't remember, what is it? What you metabolic? It's called Nutrient Optimizer, I think is what you have, isn't it?
Yeah. Our website is Optimizing Nutrition.
Yeah, okay.
We've got a tool called Nutrient Optimizer that basically says, what are you eating now? And what nutrients, what micronutrients do you need to balance that current nutrient profile?
And that is based upon current accepted, RDA, so on and so forth, requirements, more or less.
Not really. What we've done, the RDA is the minimum to prevent diseases of deficiency.
Right,
so,
right.
Which is low. It's crap.
You see it with protein. Protein for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, 0.8, it's pathetic. And, that's to avoid, muscle degeneration and death. You need a lot more protein than that. And I suppose that's the biggest thing we've found is that protein is the biggest lever of satiety, but all the other micronutrients come into play and have an important role. So you've got the protein leverage hypothesis that Rabenheimer and Simpson identified, that we keep eating until we get enough protein, but you also seem to keep eating until you get enough potassium and sodium and magnesium and all the other micronutrients that you're not currently getting enough of. So we looked at the satiety response curve from 125,000 days of data and then found that what's the point where you stop craving each of those nutrients and where are you satisfied and what's realistic from food? So we identified a optimal nutrient intake that we encourage people to strive to work towards.
Yeah. And so because you talk about until you're satisfied or till you reach that, and some of these, like fat soluble vitamins or something, and some of these probably minerals hang around with different half-lives. And so you could say you come to from some clearly garbage, malnutrition, standard American diet, or maybe even a vegan diet, and you're just low on a bunch of stuff. And then you say, okay, now I'm going to correct this. You may have different needs than when you get to sort of sufficiency, then you coast for a while. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, totally. Everybody's got a different micronutrient fingerprint that, has different micronutrient needs and therefore different foods they need to focus on to fill those gaps.
How do we know where those gaps are, Marty? How do you assess that?
Well, that's the, once you've identified the optimal nutrient intake, that's sort of the stretch target for each of those micronutrients. You can see, hey, you're getting tons of protein, so your amino acids aren't a priority, but you might need to focus on sodium or potassium or magnesium or other things that are at the other extreme. And I suppose that's debatable. But yeah, we've looked at 125,000 days of data from 35,000 people just to look at across that what works for most people most of the time that leads to a greater satiety that is achievable from food.
And then what about, there's this concept, I think it's pretty, not just a concept, but a reality that some nutrients facilitate or detract from other nutrients absorption or utilization. Can you speak to that totally. And say, like I said, like for instance, I'm on a carnivore diet. Obviously I'm low on vitamin C and manganese and folate and calcium arguably and some of those things. And so I know that there are compensatory mechanisms, like we know, like the whole theory of the acid ash, thing with calcium. Hey, high protein diets lead to hypercalciuria. Therefore, it must be coming from the bones, right? That's what we thought for years. And then somebody said, wait a minute, no, you're just absorbing more calcium. It increases your GI absorption. So we have these compensatory things arguably going on or clearly going on, and we just don't know all of them because what I'm doing is very unusual compared to 99.9% of the people on Earth. And so do you see that, like, for instance, low carb diets notoriously result in many cases in a relative decrease in T3, thyroid hormone. Some people would say that is pathologic. Other people say that's physiologic adaptation. You are now expressing thyroid sensitivity, a la insulin sensitivity, so on and so forth. So do you see that within different dietary schemes? Does a vegan diet need different things, on an average than, say, my diet, perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it's hard to break it up from the data to identify who's a vegan and who's a carnivore because most people are
right, omnivores, sure,
in the middle.
Yeah.
And the key thing that you mentioned up front is that nutrients are synergistic. So the nutrients that come in whole food come with all the other nutrients, that they work together. It's not just you can take a supplement of one isolated synthetic nutrient or fortified in food and expect it to have the same effect that you're going to get from food. And the reality is that, most nutrients come with adequate protein. So if you're getting enough protein and less energy from carbs and fat, then you're going to get plenty of those harder to find nutrients. And if your kidneys are healthy and everything's working, it's more likely that you're going to be recycling those harder to find nutrients and getting enough of those. And, there's arguments about vitamin C, and you need less vitamin C when you're on a certain diet. And our analysis for vitamin C definitely doesn't support mega dosing of any of those nutrients. It's sort of like you see in the data, you see these people with massive amounts of supplementation and fortification that's obviously doing nothing in terms of satiety, at least. That, people who rely on fortification and supplementation tend to eat more because they tend to go, well, I've got insurance. I can eat this other crap food, which is the carbon, fat, energy from vegetable oils, industrial vegetable oils, sugars, and refined carbs that everybody's sort of living on.
What about if I just said, hey, just give me a multivitamin. I'm good, man. I like I said, I get plenty of protein. If any concerns I might have, instead of eating a bunch of kale or spinach, which I don't like, I'm not going to choke down it. I'll just take a multivitamin. Is that a reasonable strategy for somebody like me?
Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Like, I just don't see in the data that the fortification and supplementation helps people. It's the whole foods that comes together. Like you're getting a good steak, or I ate a lot of kangaroo or whatever, that you're getting that whole food. Some nutrients are easy to find on a low carb diet versus a low fat diet, and vice versa. So in some ways, optimal foraging would say, you get your protein, which gets you most of the way, and then you chase those other nutrients from across the carb fat spectrum, as you might in nature across the seasons. But
there's I wanted to I lost what I was going to think about, but another topic that I think is interesting. So CGMs are becoming popular. Probably you've played with them. I imagine your wife maybe has utilized them. They can be tremendous tools for diabetics, but we have this concept that glucose needs to be flat all the time. Damn it, if my glucose goes up 40 points, I effed up. That's the wrong food for me. And I've seen you write that, hey man, that may not be accurate. And I don't know either, because I know, like, when I get done, I'm doing workouts and I'll see my blood glucose be 160, 170, 180, sometimes 200. And I'm like, that is not good normally, but I'm like, I just got done doing a hell of a workout. Is that bad for me? Am I hurting myself by exercising? I kind of don't think so, but how do you justify, or what are your thoughts around CGM usage? I know some people say no one should have one unless they are strictly a type 1 diabetic and it's harming people by having CGMs. Is it bad to know? To me, I don't need a CGM to tell me the piece of cake is not ideal for me. But anyway, what are your thoughts around CGMs?
Yeah. It's my one of my passion topics. And for my wife and my son, CGMs are totally invaluable. And the wife is on a closed loop insulin pump that looks at where her glucose is going and modifies the insulin dosing every 5 minutes. It's just incredible. And adding on to a protein focused low carb diet has really changed her life. And having that visibility for people with hardcore diabetes is invaluable. But totally agree. It creates a lot of confusion for people who don't understand what to do with that data. And looking at, super sapiens and a few people who are playing with CGMs for athletes, what you see is when you get your heart rate right up, you rely on glucose to fuel that activity. So if you're peaking your heart rate, the liver just dumps out all this glucose into your bloodstream. So you'll see a really high blood sugar, and then maybe, hour or two later, blood sugar will come down as the muscles soak up all the glucose through non-insulin mediated glucose uptake, which doesn't require insulin. And then you're going to get hungry and want to eat. And it's good to prioritize eating after that. But in terms of, and that's another, I wrote a book called Big Fat Keto Lies because I got caught up in the keto scene. And although, lots of really valuable things in a low carb protein focused diet, but believing that you need to keep carbs low and prioritize fat leads people up the wrong path. And it's the same sort of thing that happens with CGMs is people see any blip on their glucose and say, I need to flatline that, I'll avoid all carbs and prioritize fat. So definitely in that, like we do this data-driven fasting thing. I've been number crunching there, and definitely that if you're just trying to lose weight, optimize metabolic health, having lower blood sugars before you eat is really important. So waiting until you need to refuel based on your glucose, which you can tell from your CGM or a simple glucometer, which we suggest people get because they're a whole lot cheaper for most people. But that rise after glucose just doesn't really matter. Like it doesn't correlate with better metabolic health, lower blood sugar, lower weight. And often the people that track the post-meal glucose more often and worry about the rise after they eat, if they're generally metabolically healthy, it doesn't help them. It actually has a negative effect because I think people are trying to go, well, I'm going to manage that rise after eating. And the lower the better is the belief, and thinking that that's going to help with fat loss, but it doesn't. The data says no, and that's largely a distraction. Definitely if you're type 1, type 2, injecting insulin, you don't want to see your blood sugar rise by maybe 30 milligrams per deciliter or 1.6 millimole after you eat, because then it can come crashing down and you feel really hungry, especially if you're on medication. But other than that, it's really the pre-meal. It's, do I need to refuel? Then it can be useful. But, you can do that with a normal glucometer without investing in a CGM.
Yeah, that brings an interesting point because we talk about fasting. And, if I eat, a kilo of beef, right?
Yep.
When am I actually fasting? Because we know the absorption for that is going to take a long, long, long time. And if I eat it for dinner, 8 p.m.,
Yep.
I may be still absorbing nutrition when I wake up in the morning. So I don't really have a fasting blood glucose in the morning. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, the later you eat, the higher your waking blood sugar is going to be, and the more fat you eat, actually, we tend to see a higher waking glucose. People might think that carbs late at night would lead to a higher glucose, but it seems that, more fat at night tends to lead to a waking glucose. And but what is fasting and how long do you need to fast for autophagy and blah, blah, blah. It's all just, who knows? We've got studies in mice that say if they eat every other day or don't eat for 48 hours, they get this magic autophagy that leads to magical health. But, one day in a mouse is 40 human days. So you go, okay, 48 hours is 2 days times 40 days. I need to fast for 80 days to get autophagy. Who's doing that? Nobody. It's crazy. And what leads to metabolic health is being lean, and you need to find a way of eating that enables you to be lean, which is adequate nutrition, protein on a regular basis, but not so often that you get fat. So
yeah, I think one of the things is, defining what is health, what is optimal. Because a lot of people say optimal health, and they'll have all kinds of definitions. And I don't know. I mean, I think, like I said, I think being lean, being athletic, being, strong, fit, and free of disease would be a pretty good definition to me. But then some people want to put numbers to that. Well, what is the idea? Like, if you listen to guys like Richard Bernstein, or Peter Attia at one point, 83 milligrams per deciliter of glucose is where you should strive to be. And then people are obsessed about that. And I mean, I've seen people where their blood glucose goes from, low 80s to mid 90s, and yet they're getting stronger, they're getting leaner, and they're concerned about the glucose rise. I'm like, man, I'm not sure that that's an issue. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, generally we see a better longevity risk of dying of any cause if your waking glucose is under 100, between 80 and 100. So that's sort of a healthy point. People on a lower carb diet might tend to see higher waking and then lower glucose during the day. So the overall average is lower, but if you're on a high carb diet, you might see lower waking and higher during the day. Mm-hmm. So as an overall average, you want to keep your average low, but it's not about flatlining. When you eat, your blood sugar is allowed to rise a little bit, say up to 30 milligrams per deciliter. Most people we see in our challenges, just crunching the numbers, is 16 milligrams per deciliter, which is not excessive, but it's not, you're not trying to flatline it with a very high fat, low carb, and even low protein diet. And a lot of people, I think, get caught with, protein stimulates insulin, and that sometimes raises my blood sugars, so I'm going to avoid the protein as well. And that's the absolute wrong thing that I think we've got caught up with the keto movement, trying to maximize ketones and minimize insulin in the short term, but you maximize insulin in the long term by getting too fat.
What is, so let's talk about the definite hyperinsulinemia. We hear about that a lot. That's clearly, it's in the medical literature that's associated with all kinds of things. How would you define hyperinsulinemia, realizing that we need insulin? I mean, insulin is incredibly important. Like you said, your son without insulin loses all his muscle. He's probably got no energy. And so it does have a definite positive benefit to it. So how do we sort of say, there's fasting insulin people look at, there's other things. How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, just come back to that insight from type 1 diabetes that the majority of your insulin you need each day, 80% is just to hold your stored energy in storage to prevent your fat and your glucose and your muscles from breaking down and flowing into your bloodstream. So if a type 1 diabetic, not enough insulin, they'll basically disintegrate into the bloodstream. So you need enough insulin to stop that happening. But the bigger you are, the fatter you are, the more insulin your pancreas will need to produce to do that. But on the flip side, if you're active, you've got all this non-insulin mediated glucose uptake happening that, you're using that carbohydrate without the need for insulin to be secreted. It's basically just going straight into the muscles through an osmotic gradient that goes from your liver to your bloodstream, to your interstitial fluid, to your muscles, and it just disappears without the need for insulin to push it in. High insulin after you eat is really just, a function of our modern world where we've got too much energy all the time, and you've got too much energy in your bloodstream because you've got too much energy in your body, and the insulin has to sort of try to force it in. But that shouldn't be the case if you're lean and healthy. So if you waist to height ratio, if you look in the mirror and you're reasonably muscular and not overly fat, then you're going to have really healthy insulin levels.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the term diabulimia, where you have diabetics that will intentionally not give themselves insulin and they'll lose weight, and it's like a dietary goal because, like you said, their body is melting into glucose and they're peeing it all out, which has some deleterious effects, arguably.
I used to think that's what I wanted. I thought that if I didn't eat carbohydrate, then my pancreas would turn off and I wouldn't produce any insulin, therefore waste away. But the more I ate butter and MCT oil trying to chase high ketones, the fatter I got. And obviously it wasn't working for me because my pancreas works. So you can't make diabulimia happen for you. And that's basically the carb insulin hypothesis, that it doesn't really happen.
Yeah. I mean, you can do that if you're type 1 diabetic is what I'm saying. They can do that.
But you can't if your pancreas works.
If your pancreas works. Yeah. And that's, and I think you get guys like Dave Asprey with the butter cup, the bulletproof coffee. I remember when that came out, I was sitting outside the operating room and somebody was telling me about bulletproof coffee. And I looked at him and went, what the hell are you talking about? He was talking about drinking butter and oil in his coffee. I thought, and this was like 10, 12 years ago, whenever it came out. And I was just like, this sounds pretty bizarre. It didn't make sense at the time. And, in retrospect, it probably still doesn't make sense just to mindlessly pour a bunch of fat in there. I guess the thought was, well, it makes me not hungry and I won't eat breakfast, and the net caloric
instead of 1,000 calories in your coffee.
Yeah. It depends on how much you do, I suppose. Have you looked into, normal amount of insulin for a healthy human to secrete? I've read like a normal person secretes about 30 to 50 IUs equivalent per day. I don't know. Have you looked into that literature? Have you seen how much what we normally secrete?
That sounds about right. I mean, a healthy fasting insulin might be 4. My son, when he was diagnosed, had an insulin of 1. I got my insulin tested and it was 1, but that was after a bike ride. The wife is on about 35. The son might be on 45 units of insulin per day because he's growing and he's a teenager and he's doing a whole lot of lifting and playing rugby. And so he's got to process a lot of food. And he's probably going from 77 kilos to 90 kilos and, growing back to the size he should have been before he got type 1 diabetes. So that's about right. Yeah.
It's interesting, that, even activity is going to drive that to some degree. So like when your son, like I mentioned, when I exercise, was kind of fun. I knew I was talking to you, so I was checking today, and I think I'm doing these, I don't know if you know from me, Wingate protocols, Wingate tests. So they're basically, they're awful, brutal, disgustingly horrible bike sprints. And
everybody hates them.
Yeah, I'm doing those. I'm doing them multiple times a day just for fun because I'm a weirdo. And so I'm checking my blood glucose after this. And I think this, I'm doing like 4 sets of these today, which is a lot. But I did, I did one, and my blood glucose went from 98 to 135 or something like that. And then, but then I ate, and then it was down to 72. So it was actually lower after I ate, but higher after the exercise, which I just think is interesting. And so so when your son exercises and he gets a rise in his blood glucose, is he dosing for that? Or how does he treat exercise?
Yeah, no, just because the muscle will use that, because the cortisol, the adrenaline, the high heart rate will stimulate increased glucose, which is then soaked up by the muscles without the need for insulin. And yeah, that's definitely important not to dose for that. So if you're in a closed loop pump system, you'll increase your temporary target for a while, just so the pump doesn't push out more insulin to drop your glucose at that point. Because non-insulin mediated glucose uptake, 83% of glucose uptake is through without insulin. So people on a low carb diet actually don't need their pancreas to produce insulin for their food. It's just to hold their stored fat in storage. So you don't need to do that after exercise. But what we find is a lot of the time, I'll do a heavy squat workout or whatever. In the hours afterwards, glucose goes back into your muscles, gets soaked up, and then you get hungry. And it's really important to prioritize good food in that period after, when your blood sugars start to crash. Otherwise, if you take it too long, you're going to be too hungry at that point and just eat anything and everything. So what you did after you eat after you work out. And often when you eat protein, your blood sugar falls further. And a lot of the time we see people who, if they prioritize protein in the morning when their glucose is elevated due to dawn phenomenon, they'll tend to drop their blood sugars, and they can eat again in the afternoon and have 2 or 3 meals a day without having to fast forever because the blood sugar is elevated due to dawn phenomenon.
Do you have a concern? Is there an upper threshold for protein that you're concerned about? Is it, it's 35%, something? And again, percentages kind of get weird because you don't know how much people are eating. If I'm only eating 1,000 calories a day, 35% is nothing. That's like a few grams or something.
Totally.
So how do we you look at the work of Jose Antonio and others, and they're like, man, you can eat as much as you want. Do you have any concerns about overconsumption of protein?
Basically, no. It's really hard to eat too much protein. Every time in our macros masterclass, people go, "Oh, am I eating too much protein?" It's like, try to eat too much protein without fat and carbs. If you're increasing your protein percentage, it's really hard to overeat those foods. The lean protein, your appetite, your satiety kicks in, and you don't want to eat more of that. What you crave at that point is easy energy from, the peanut butter or whatever your go-to kryptonite food is. That'll give you energy really quickly. I suppose most people are maybe 15% and moving up to 40% if you're looking for greater satiety. Weight loss is a good play, but that's only if you're trying to lose weight. Where it gets to be too much is where you can't sustain that current protein percentage. So if people jump from 15 to 50% overnight, they're going to be craving that energy from the fat and carbs. So if they find themselves binging on the not optimal foods, then dial it back a little bit so you're getting the energy and nutrients without pushing it too hard that you can't sustain.
Yeah, I can't, like the chicken breast and that type of thing is just, I guess, I'm thinking about, I can get protein powders and I can easily consume hundreds and hundreds of grams of that. It's not very satiating. It's rapidly absorbed.
Totally. It's a processed food to some extent.
Right. And, I look at it and I think Gabor Adrosio, who you may or not be familiar with, made a really nice point to me, which resonated with me, that we really aren't designed to be ingesting powders of any type. That's just not, our human species just how would you make powder in wild? I mean, it doesn't exist. And, the absorption characteristics and the surface area to energy ratio is so incredibly skewed towards maximum absorption. So one of the reasons we can feed more people, quite honestly, more calories is because we process it and make it more readily bioavailable. If I had to chew on a stalk of wheat, the little fruit or whatever from the wheat, it would take me a long time to get the equivalent amount of calories than I could in a piece of bread. So a big difference, with regard to the other thing he mentioned, and this is something with diabetics I thought was interesting and something I'd kind of seen, when we're in the hospital and you have a patient whose blood sugar is up, they do everything in their power to really knock it down with insulin. I mean, you put them on a sliding scale. There's this thought of, stress hyperglycemia. And when you dig deeper into the literature on that, there's really one small study that dictated that being the rationale for doing this. And I would, like I said, I had a patient in the hospital. You almost always put a sliding scale out there just because you want their glucose a certain level. And maybe we shouldn't have been feeding them the Coca-Colas and the pancakes with syrup for breakfast. That's a different argument. But what he mentioned was, hey, look, when you're under stress, when you have a cold, and I'm sure your wife's experienced, blood glucose is really difficult to control because your body is like trying to pump that glucose out there. And it's there for a reason. It's there. It assists the macrophages in their activity. It basically assists the immune system. And so what does she do? I mean, what are your thoughts around that? I mean, I know you're not a doctor, but you deal with a type 1 diabetic.
Yeah. I mean, with dietary fasting, we've got little we've got little triggers that will, for events such as pain and stress and poor sleep, and menses for women. So in that period between ovulation and the start of bleeding menses, women will tend to have more elevated blood sugars and insulin and more cravings. So all those factors definitely relate to more elevated glucose. So if you're sick, your body will dump out a bit more glucose for the recovery because you're inflamed. If you've just done a massive workout, similar, your body is dumping out more glucose. And that's, just to be accepted to some degree for a period. And the solution is to get some good sleep, manage the pain, manage the stress, and then the blood sugars come down. So hammering that more with insulin, I think, is, not a great idea because it'll just make people more hungry and eat more and store more energy. So yeah, endogenous insulin, is great from your own pancreas, but if you keep hammering in more exogenous insulin to try and get lower blood sugars to fight the natural process, I definitely don't think it's ideal.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So we have a lot of people that are carnivore, and I know you've written up that the carnivore diet has got some holes in it, at least from your perspective. So what are those holes, and how do we know? I mean, outside of a blood test, but is there some symptoms? Like I could look at folate deficiency, and I'm not pregnant. I'm worried about neural tube defects. It's not something that's big on my mind. But then I look at there's macrocytic anemia. People get sores in their mouth. I don't have any of those things. I've checked my folate; it was low. I don't have any symptoms. So, I mean, how do we? What are your major concerns, and how to address them? If somebody says I'm anti-dogmatism. I think people do what works for them. But let's just play. Hey, Marty's looking at your diet. Where are the holes at? I eat ribeye. I'm ribeye, steaks, and eggs. I've been this for 6 years. Amazingly, I'm not dead yet, Marty. I'm still doing well. But anyway,
you're thriving. And I've heard a bunch of your podcasts, and you're definitely non-dogmatic about carnivore. Carnivore is optimal for everyone, and that's really good. And I suppose that's sort of my point, is that I grew up in a Seventh Adventist home that was the center of religious dietary dogma that's influenced a massive amount. You probably understand, but I think most people understand how much the SDA belief system has influenced
nutrition. Yeah,
nutrition.
They're the founders of the U.S. dietary organization.
Exactly, yeah. It's massive, and it's all the confluence of this misguided ethical, sustainable, and religious and commercial confluence to come together to have this nutritional guidance that's is going to be really hard to beat. So I suppose I'm very anti. The catch line is your diet doesn't need a name or a belief system; it just needs enough nutrients. But when it comes to a carnivore diet, I mean, it's it works brilliantly, especially for an elimination diet. If you've got digestive issues, for my wife, to prioritize protein and take out a lot of those autoimmune inflammatory foods, it's a really, really good place to start to get enough protein. There are some nutrients like magnesium, potassium, vitamin C, folate, K1 that might be harder to get on a carnivore diet, but at the same time, to some extent, your body is really smart, is able to recycle those and work with that. I suppose you and the thriving carnivore community evidence that is the case, that your body does pretty well. But if you want to look at optimal, is it optimal for everybody? Not sure. I sort of want to thread the needle between some people are on a whole food plant-based diet and thriving to some extent. You'd argue not optimal protein, and they're a bit sarcopenic and not getting a whole bunch of nutrients at that extreme. And then at the carnivore extreme, people are probably thriving a hell of a lot more. But, what is it in between those extremes that seem to work to some degree? What are the key things we need to eliminate? And really, to eliminate those, it's about prioritizing the nutrients within your energy budget. So that's sort of my thing, is to go, let's look at everybody. Let's develop a system that works for everybody, to say all you need to do is prioritize the nutrients you need without excess energy, without a named diet belief system.
Yeah. And I think the real challenge for most people is, well, there's a lot of challenges out there. I mean, there's a lot of psychological aspects of why we eat. And that's probably as big of a part of the actual, physiology that's going on. It's over-consuming the energy part is a challenge for a lot of people. And the food industry doesn't make it easy, because they make delicious, tempting, well-marketed, addictive. I mean, I'll say it, they're addictive type of foods that are everywhere, and they're cheap, and they are lauded. I mean, it's like, hey, you deserve it. There are rewards for people for, hey, you survived your day. It's Monday. Why not? Hey, it's Friday. Why not? Hey, it's your birthday. Hey, it's my birthday. Hey, it's a long week. It never ends, right? There's never ending reasons to eat this garbage. Totally. And so how do we, obviously, and my bent would be, hey, eat high quality, nutritious food in abundance, and you're not going to want that stuff. Does that hold up for you? Does that line of reasoning?
Yeah, absolutely. If you get, all the whole dietary system and dietary advice is about, avoid cholesterol, avoid salt, avoid protein, avoid this, avoid that, and it just leaves people confused. That a dietary system that focuses on what you shouldn't eat just leaves you completely confused and not knowing what to eat. But definitely, if you prioritize getting the nutrients your body needs, your appetite just settles down and you no longer feel addicted. But the food system is designed with, we've got this, we worked out how to dump energy from non-renewable gas, methane, into fossil fuel fertilizers that we throw into our food system. And then in the 50s, 60s, we amped up the way we produce food. And it's just dumping non-renewable energy into the ground, into a food system, to have refined industrial oils, sugars, refined grains that are cheap, hyper palatable. You add some, flavors, colors, and a bit of crap fortification of food to make the label look good. And you can't stop eating those foods, and they're super cheap. And it's, the only way to untangle that is to say, are you getting the nutrients you need within your energy budget? And then your appetite settles down.
Yeah, I'm just, when I'm looking at, we have a nutrition guidelines, it's, limit your saturated fat to 10% and sugar to this and blah, blah, blah.
Crazy.
And, I'm looking at Brazil's guidelines here, which I think, this is what they say: make natural or minimally processed foods the basis of your diet. Use oils, fats, salts, and sugar in small amounts when seasoning and cooking natural or minimally processed foods to create a culinary preparation. So basically, just eat whole foods and cook at home. I mean, basically, that should be our guidelines, honestly, in the United States. I mean, that's all you need. All the rest of the stuff is just garbage in my view. And, anyway.
Yeah. And I've tried to, as an engineer, I want to quantify that to smash all the crap nutritional advice to say, look, if you do get the nutrients you need within your energy budget, everything else works out. You don't need to worry about cholesterol and saturated fat and salt and all these other boogeymen that make you eat more of the plant-based garbage that's in the center aisles of the supermarket.
Yeah, that's the thing, because they'll say, well, we're going to make something low in saturated fat and low in cholesterol and low in sodium perhaps and low in sugar. And we're gonna make it with canola oil and sucrose, or not sucrose, sucralose, and and just mix it into a glop with pea protein and call it an energy bar and say it's healthy for you and it's saving the environment, when really it's just a disaster, right? I mean,
absolutely crazy, and the amount of energy in our food system from industrial seed oils has increased by 600 calories per person per day over the last 100 years. If you're looking for a smoking gun, it's just the industrial seed oils.
600 calories per day?
Yeah, it's a crazy amount over the last 100 years since we learned to make industrial seed oils from pea protein and whatever, canola oil. It's just consistently gone up over the last 100 years.
So that's like what is that, 80 grams a person per day or something like that? That's an incredible amount.
It's a crazy addition. I mean, protein has sort of gone up a little bit, but gone down in percentage terms since the 1977 food guidelines. And carbs has gone down and then up and down a little bit. And overall, they're fairly average similar over the last 100 years. But the addition of industrial fats into our food system is massive.
Do you think they're inherently bad, or do you think they're inherently bad because they're just producing a caloric excess and they're in every pile of junk food there is?
Yeah, I'd probably go for the second. If you're overeating energy you don't need, you're going to get inflamed. And there's endless debates over saturated fat versus monounsaturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat, and which one's the boogeyman that you should be avoiding this week. But if you're eating a truck ton more of them because you're eating industrial produced foods, you're just getting too much energy.
Yeah, you see that with like fatty liver, for instance. Some people say, well, it's a fructose. No, it's a saturated fat. And you're just like, all of these studies that show this are always overfeeding studies. I mean, it's almost clearly overfeeding studies. So whatever you're feeding, overfeeding, and whether, you develop, this is another interesting thing, and the vegans like to point to, well, saturated in the blood, particularly palmitic acid, leads to the accumulation of ceramides, which then blunt the insulin sensitivity, and then you become insulin resistant. But then they fail to say that palmitic acid is primarily coming from the liver via de novo lipogenesis, which is created through a caloric excess of anything. And it could be overeating carbs, it could be overeating fat, and it's just a, we have these little snippets of information, and people try to, expand it to meet their particular religious belief. And it's kind of interesting to see. What are your thoughts? I mean, let's just talk about that. Cholesterol, saturated fat. A lot of people on a carnivore diet, low carb diet, see their cholesterol go up, yet their HDL goes up, their triglycerides go down, they become leaner, their inflammatory markers. What's your perspective on that, on the cholesterol? Yeah. Is it demonized? Should we avoid it at all costs? It's serum cholesterol rather.
Yeah, I love it. Great question. I suppose on the saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat, from what I can see from the research, saturated fat, you might become insulin resistant sooner, which sounds bad, but your sort of satiety kicks in and your body says, well, I don't need any more energy from that saturated fat because I've become insulin resistant. But on the other hand, the unsaturated fat just allows you to keep on eating and eating and eating and eating. So you don't become insulin resistant as soon. You just keep on eating more energy. And so you get a lot fatter before you become insulin resistant diabetic. But on cholesterol, we definitely see more cholesterol per calorie aligned with greater satiety. So it's just crazy that we've demonized cholesterol until the 2015 dietary guidelines when they said, oh, oops, cholesterol's not that bad.
Yeah, but I got a, I'm going to interject here, Marty, because I've got a question about that. Because, when the dietary guidelines says, cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern, which is what they said. It's not, don't worry about cholesterol anymore. But it's impossible to get cholesterol without getting saturated fat, just about. It's in eggs, it's in fruits, and everything that has saturated fat has cholesterol in it. And say we're going to ignore cholesterol, but don't eat saturated fat, or limit your saturated fat. So it's like, how do you align those two concepts? Because it's like, if I'm eating a food with cholesterol in it, it doesn't, right?
It doesn't align. And that's what I've been doing the analysis on, looking at the long-term trends and all these things like cholesterol, and cholesterol's gone down and obesity's just gone up. But in terms of, I don't know, I'm a dumb engineer who doesn't understand Peter Attia and Dave Feldman's detail on all the, which LDL particle is bad this week. But what I understand is that, in the food system, if you're eating fat and carbs together, you'll eat more and get fat. And similarly, if you're fueling on glucose and have low fat in your blood, then that's sort of okay. And the other extreme, if you've got, higher fat and lower glucose in your blood, is sort of okay. But where you get into trouble is where you've got high LDL and lots of fat in your blood and high glucose. The LDL becomes oxidized because it's hanging around with the glucose, and that's when you get into trouble. So it's just the same theme again and again through all my work is, fat plus carbs together leads to overeating, obesity, and poor metabolic health. So it's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder.
In the bloodstream.
I wonder if you do like, let's just say I take 10 cc's of blood from somebody, and how many calories in this blood? Someone's going to be glucose, someone's going to be fat, and I can say this is how much calories in this guy's blood, and this is how much calories in that guy's blood, and the guy with less calories in his blood presumably might be doing better. Perhaps it depends on the time of the day and the circumstances, obviously, and it may be. And we talked about the nuance of fasting. If we're eating high fat in the evening, then our morning blood glucose. So it's really a hard thing to simulate the exact same circumstances, because fat, like I said, fasting is it's kind of an arbitrary term depending on when you last ate and what you ate, really. So, totally. But I mean, would that be fair?
But the bottom line is that if you've got lots of fat in your body, you're going to have more of that spilling over into your blood, because your insulin can't hold all that in storage. You become insulin resistant. Your pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin to lock it all away, so it overflows into your blood. So if you've got lots of glucose and fat and even ketones, you think of it as a total energy in your bloodstream. The more you've got hanging around in your blood, the worse your metabolic health is, unless you're doing a Wingate exercise and you need that energy. Most of the time, the most metabolically healthy people have lower energy in their blood, lower energy in their body, lower waist to height ratio, lower body fat levels, with adequate muscle.
Yeah, that kind of touches on that concept of the personal fat threshold that Ted Naiman has been talking about for a few years. And, like I said, that's why some people say, well, we see these folks in East India, that are relatively not very obese, but yet they're metabolically floating around with a ton of energy in their blood, and for some reason, is there a genetic component to that? Probably to some degree, I would imagine, but maybe some of the dietary patterns make that as well. Maybe because they're under protein, at least in America, protein's not hard to come by, and so we have, I don't think we have a protein deficiency availability. It's there. I think many people just overeat the other garbage on top of that, which is a problem. But if you go to places like India, where you've got a high vegetarian population, probably they have a relatively per capita lower protein consumption, or bioavailable protein. I don't think they're getting as much from the beans, and maybe some from the dairy. Dairy is actually a pretty good source of protein, but it might be an interesting just thought, protein, energy, and those types of diets, and where the personal fat threshold in, or is it purely genetic? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you'd imagine there's some people like the Pacific Islanders who might do a whole lot better if, they got to those Pacific Islands by rowing for days and weeks, and the fatter ones, at the start survived the journey and made it to the island. So you can imagine there's different indigenous populations where being able to build a lot of fat before you become diabetic is really advantageous, but other populations definitely seem to have a lower fat threshold, that they can only gain so much weight, so much fat on their body before it starts to spill over into the bloodstream, and they become metabolically deranged. It's
almost kind of the physiology of a bear, perhaps, going for hibernation. I don't think bears are diabetic. I think they tolerate that pretty well. They put on they gorge and then they hang out for however many months, something like that. Yeah, I guess, and you've probably seen there's some evolutionary thoughts that insulin resistance was advantageous for certain populations, and particularly around the ice ages when we didn't have a lot of access to carbohydrates, and therefore it was probably beneficial to shunt glucose away from some tissues towards others, and so on and so forth, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So I'm trying to get some of the takeaways from this, Marty. I don't want to keep you too long. We usually do this about an hour, so, if we look at optimal health, which I think is still a very difficult term to define, whatever you're eating, as long as it produces leanness, I'd say adequate muscle, it's probably in general okay. And of course, there's always going to be some edge cases, some people that need the elimination diets, have the certain disease conditions that require. And have you seen? I guess I should ask you this. So certain diseases, do you see different needs? Does it exacerbate the need for something else? Does it change things? So say somebody has Crohn's disease. I don't know if you get into this. Obviously, there may be wasting, or maybe if they have depression, maybe they need more of this or more of that. Have you been able to look into that at all?
Yeah, I suppose we've dove into cancer and a bunch of different, looking at low oxalate diets and low FODMAP diets, and people who have those conditions have different micronutrient requirements. But I don't think that's the majority of the population. There's definitely a need for people who have those issues and sensitivities. But I think, 90 to 99% of people just need nutrients without excess energy. And the first lever is protein, to get enough protein. And there's so much debate in the carnivore versus, Ted Naiman's high protein versus, other people who want to keep eating tons of fat and avoid protein because they get too full on it. And, you just need to find, where are you now? If you're a bit over fat, you need to go from, where you are now to add another 5% protein and dial back the energy from fat and carbs and find that balance point that works for you. And from there, once you've got that balance point, it's like, okay, what other micronutrients might you need to chase that might add to that? And where can you get that in your dietary perspective? And if you're following a vegan diet, it's probably going to be hard to get a bunch of those nutrients, especially protein. And if you're a strict carnivore, it might be harder, but you can chase the organ meats and the like just to top those nutrients off potentially if you want to go for optimal.
Do you see any, we talked about protein, the macronutrients, and you've talked quite a bit about micronutrients in general. Do you see some people, I'm just craving this, I'm craving something. Do you ever see is there a nutrient that obviously you want to, let's say we want to get whatever. I like a pound per gram, a gram per pound of body weight of protein is a nice place for me to be. Sometimes I'll exceed that. Usually I exceed that, quite honestly. But when it comes to you're saying, well, I'm still hungry, and you said, well, maybe protein, you hit your protein requirements clearly, and you're still hungry. What else is there? Is it just I want some carbs or fat, or is there maybe I need some magnesium? Maybe I need. Do you see that? Do you see a common one that's often missed?
Yeah. All of the above. Definitely once you hit your protein requirement, you're then craving energy to get enough energy because you can't make ATP from protein very easily. And there's a lot of work for your body to do that. So it then goes, give me the fat or carbs. If your glucose is low, you'll be craving carbs rather than fat potentially. But there's definitely a similar micronutrient leverage effect where people are craving certain micronutrients. And we see in our macros masterclass when people dial in all those harder to find micronutrients in their diet, they're just going, I've lost interest in food. I'm satisfied and I'm comfortably satisfied. And it's like people have said, I'm satisfied at a cellular level now. And that's a really beautiful thing. I think that you're no longer addicted to food. You've got the nutrients you need from the food you're eating.
Yeah. I kind of 5 or 6 years ago when I was first on Twitter and I was kind of just waking up to some of this stuff, I'd been looking at nutrition for several years. I just kind of said, hey, if you're, I was talking about fasting and I said, if your diet should probably naturally lend itself, if you're getting the nutrients you need, then your appetite will follow. That's kind of a rudimentary thing, what you were talking about. But I was like, maybe we eat to get the nutrition we need, which would make sense. I mean, that would make the most sense, right? Why are we hungry? Why are you hungry in the first place? Well, because you need something, right? I mean, unfortunately, we're given the things we don't need in many cases. We're given these
and told to fear all these boogeymen in their food, like the saturated fat and cholesterol and salt, and all these things seem to be beneficial largely.
I wanted to, just you said the masterclass on nutrition, and I want you to share where people can go on that in a second. But I'm just curious, because I do see people say, "Hey, I ate friggin' 4 pounds of ribeye, man. I'm still hungry, dude. What do I do?" And I'm trying to think, well, these are things you can do to take your mind off your appetite. And there's things that clearly suppress satiety. High intensity exercise shuts down appetite and has an anorexic effect. You could stretch things out. You can go for a walk, whatever. I mean, but is there I can say, well, maybe just pop a multivitamin, dude. Obviously I don't know how that works, as far as, rapid absorption.
Multivitamins,
garbage,
supplemental nutrients, just don't eat synthetic isolated.
Yeah, I get it. I'm saying ingest, but I'm just thinking, where can you, like I said, I'm just wondering what are the most common things. Is it magnesium that people are usually falling short on? Yeah,
definitely. We see a massive, satiety response to protein is number one, but then potassium, cholesterol, folate, calcium, niacin. A lot of these are statistically significant from our analysis that people do seem to have a particular micronutrient leverage effect from those nutrients. But I mean, on a carnivore diet, I don't know, you can create glucose from protein, but maybe if your glucose is low, maybe you're craving carbs, maybe craving fat as the highest priority. And especially if you've jumped, like I said, from a low protein percentage to a high protein percentage overnight, and you're not adapting to that well, you're probably craving more energy from fat or carbs, especially if you're active. But then the other, on top of that, it's the other micronutrients.
Do you think that diabetics have a lower protein requirement than non-diabetics as far as blood glucose regulation, either type 1 or type 2?
I think potentially, I mean, if you look at Rubbenheimer and Simpson's obesity leverage hypothesis, they made a really good point that the protein requirements are going up because we're becoming insulin resistant. And when we become insulin resistant, more of the protein you're eating is being lost to glucose through gluconeogenesis. So we're actually having to eat more protein. So the more risk you are of having high glucose, you actually need more protein. So it's the opposite of what a lot of the keto gurus have been preaching for the last 5 years. It's, don't avoid protein if you're diabetic. Actually prioritize protein, which will help with satiety and make up for the protein being lost to glucose.
Yeah. And in your mind, like I said, when I exercise hard, my glucose goes up, sometimes fairly high. And it's, and traditionally people say, well, that's causing glycation, causing damage. Are you in an environment where that's not occurring because you've got this huge catecholamine surge? Things are different. Maybe it's not being oxidized in the same way as if I was just laying on my couch and my blood glucose was the same level. Do you think it's fair to say that that's probably going on?
The short-term elevation due to exercise is maybe if you're a marathon runner and doing 80 hours of running a week, you might be inflamed all the time and have, that might be a problem, but you've got other issues at that point. But just for the general person getting out and exercising, having elevated glucose that's temporarily elevated, and most of the time they've got a low average glucose, they're in a really good position versus someone who's sitting on the couch eating the Cheetos and whatever, and sitting at really high glucose all the time, which that's when it gets dangerous.
Yeah, I think I certainly would see why that is. Do you have you mentioned protein averages? You've got 125,000 data points on 35,000 people.
Yeah.
Is there a protein this is where most people should probably be, and then there's reasons to deviate up or down from that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the average population from the USDA data, people sitting at 13 to 15% protein. Our data sits at 28% average protein, and people tend to work up to 40% protein. But it's a matter of finding out where you are now and working up in that direction, not just ripping off the Band-Aid and jumping off the cliff and going, I'm just going to eat nothing but egg whites and chicken breasts for the next week. And then people are going, I'm so hungry. I'm just binging on everything and anything. So it's just, find out where you are now and nudge that a little bit. If you're getting the progress you need, you don't need to move any further. But if you still need to lose weight, then nudge it a little bit more. When you find your goal, when you're at your goal weight, move back, because someone like you is going to need more energy from the fat and less protein. So I think that's the thing that's lost in the noise of the high versus low protein thing. It's just like, where are you now? And let's nudge it a little bit. And that's what optimizing nutrition is all about. It's finding where are you now and where do you need to move to. And it's usually just a little tweak rather than a massive extreme jump.
Yeah, I find that, my diet is usually somewhere between 30 and 40% protein. That's sort of where I sort of gravitate most of the time. Rarely do I exceed that. But protein sparing modified fasts have now become the latest sort of trend within the low carb community. Yeah, we get these trends. It was
Yep.
butter chugging for a few years, and then it became
Now it's swung to the other extreme.
Yeah, then it was eat a bunch of meat, and now it's like, let's just eat a bunch of protein. And Ted's been sort of championing that, and I think I think in general we're heading maybe in the right direction. But protein sparing modified fasts, that's not sustainable. Clearly, I mean, do you have any concerns about that particular approach?
Just because it's not sustainable, it is the most efficient, effective way of losing weight really quickly while preserving your lean muscle mass, which is really important during weight loss to get enough protein to prevent loss of lean muscle. But, the studies show that over the long term, especially if you don't learn to eat well on the way down, you'll be back up at the same point as everybody else in a couple of years. So I just think it's really important to I'm just boring. I've seen too many people lose weight really quickly and then a couple of months later just rebound. So we just say, if you're losing between 0.5% and 1% per week, good for you. Change nothing. If you're losing quicker than 1%, just beware that your lizard brain's going to kick in eventually and say, I need energy. And if you don't learn to control that, if you don't learn to eat well, when you're losing weight, you're probably going to find yourself rebounding and regaining a bunch of weight. So yeah, just a sustainable rate of weight loss is better than rapid weight loss and looking fat in 6 months' time.
Why do we have, I don't see that often, more so with type 1s, but occasionally type 2s. Why do we have skinny diabetics? What's the story on those guys?
I think it's just back to the personal fat threshold that some people are blessed, in inverted commas, with the ability to gain a lot of fat before the fat overflows. But some people can be quite lean, especially if they don't have enough muscle to soak up all the glucose and use the glucose that they're eating, the energy in general, fat and carbs. You just, if you're under muscled, you're not using the energy you're eating, you're probably not moving a lot. And then it doesn't take much fat on your body before your body goes, I can't hold this in storage, and it overflows into your bloodstream as diabetes.
Is your son using one of those closed loop insulin devices as well?
Yeah, the technology is, my wife got a combo pump, which is sort of hacked by the parents and people with type 1 diabetes. And, but then Medtronic bought the combo pump so they can shut it down and it couldn't be hacked anymore. So we're currently waiting for the next system to come out so we can get a closed loop system. But the technology being done by people who have diabetes and parents of kids with diabetes is 10 years ahead of what people like Medtronic are actually putting out there to market, which is really sad. But yeah, hopefully in a couple of months he'll have a closed loop system as well. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, because it's amazing the advances in the technology there on that particular front. It's kind of a double-edged sword because a lot of I think still type 2 diabetes predominates. It's the vast majority, like 95% of people are type 2 diabetics, and we have this belief that technology is going to solve the problem. Really, it's managing the problem. It's not. It's a nutrition problem, and I think that's the interesting thing there with the type 1.
They seem to cure diabetes every 5 years, but actual cures are garbage in the best ways. Really, Dr. Bernstein prioritize protein, dial back carbs, and you've managed the symptom really well. And through technology like the closed loop pumps, you can optimize a little bit more, but it's fundamentally a diet for type 1 or type 2 diabetes and everybody else.
Yeah. Marty, anything else you want to share? I know I've kept you longer than I wanted to, but you're
it's been a whole lot of fun to chat, and an honor. And I love all the points we've touched on, and I love you taking this and, just helping people get lean, strong, and get enough protein is really important.
Tell us where to go to find out, because I think a lot of people would be interested in that nutrient optimization system, particularly like maximizing some of these things to prevent cravings, perhaps, or other reasons. But where do they go? How do they find you on social media?
Got a bunch of stuff on social under Optimising Nutrition. So Google Optimising Nutrition. We've got a blog. We've got a data-driven fasting course, which is not really about fasting. It's really anti-fasting and teaching people to eat when they need to eat based on their blood sugar. And then we've got a macros masterclass that helps people dial in their protein, fat, and carbs. As I said, find out where you are and just nudge yourself so you make sustainable progress. And then a micronutrient masterclass for people who want to take it to the next level and dial in on those harder to find micronutrients from food. So we basically say, hey, what are you eating and what foods and meals will help you dial that in, whether you're vegan or plant-based or carnivore or somewhere in between. So check that out. Really appreciate the time.
Yeah, just one more question, Mark, because you brought something up. So eat based upon your glucose. Now, I can see, I don't know what number, you'll have to multiply everything by 18, I think, to get to the units I'm used to doing. But is there a similar thing? Like, could you eat according to your ketone level? Because again, if you're worried about energy in the blood and when to eat, is that something that's ever been discussed or thought about?
Just been crunching the numbers on that, and people are doing data-driven fasting, also measuring their ketones. If you're losing weight, your ketones are down 0.4, 0.3, and your glucose is low. So if your glucose is low, you've got a lower total energy. You're going to have high ketones if you're eating a whole lot of fat, but you're going to gain fat if it's endogenous ketosis rather than, you're going to gain fat if it's exogenous ketosis from outside your body. But if the ketones are coming from inside your body and you've got a lower total energy because you're actually losing fat off your body, you can have lower total energy in your blood and therefore fairly low ketones. So the blood ketones just seem to be a distracting measurement, and the glucose is just really useful to time when you eat and understand how the meals you eat affect your blood sugar.
How does glucose levels, outside of a hypoglycemic episode, does it consistently correlate with actual hunger? Like, hey, I'm hungry and I check my blood glucose and it's going to be lower. Is that a pretty good relationship?
We've got data in the app, in the data-driven fasting app. People identify their hunger before they eat, and that just directly linearly correlates with their glucose level and their hunger level. It's really beautiful data. Complete linear relationship between hunger and glucose level.
Is there a number? Is there a number that typically you can say this is when you're going to be hungry typically, or is it very personal?
The number is personalized. So in the first 3 days of the data-driven fasting challenges, we look at your current baseline. So we could say, you need to reach a glucose of 83 before you eat, but for people with elevated glucose, that just wouldn't work. So we find out what your personal trigger is in the first 3 days, and then going forward, you just have to wait until your glucose gets below that, and then progressive overload, we keep dropping that slowly, and you keep chasing a lower pre-meal trigger, and then the glucose drops, the waking glucose drops, the body fat drops, the weight drops, and people relearn their true hunger signals. Yeah, it's really cool.
And when someone gets to like lean, or whatever, maintenance, what are we silly saying, 83 or something like that? Or
somewhere around that as a pre-meal. Yeah. So is typical, but it depends on how big you are. And obviously, I think you've been through, if you're a bit bigger like you and me, then you may have a healthy level of body fat, but your glucose tend to be higher than someone who's smaller and leaner at the same time. So it varies. You just need to find your level that aligns with optimal body composition.
Got it. Well, Marty, it's been a wonderful conversation. I'll let you get back to your Wednesday morning there in Brisbane, and hopefully we'll chat again sometime, Marty. Okay?
Yeah.
Thanks,
Real
guys.
honor. Thanks, Shawn. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Same likewise. Guys, I'm going tomorrow. I got to fly to California tomorrow morning, but I'll be back whatever the next day is, Thursday. So you guys take care. Thanks, Marty. Bye-bye now.
Cheers, Shawn.